Hello, my friends. We have been in the last few episodes talking of the second millennium AD with regards to the Indic civilization, all the invasions and how they affected the structures of the civilization. But then now we are at the beginning of the 19th century, the 1800s, and let us look at some of the important events that impact our civilization.
Did you know that in the First War of Independence in 1857, the Sikhs they fought on the side of the British? Yes, that was because the Sikh Empire, which came into being by 1800, barely lasted for about 50 years. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who stitched together this empire, expired in 1838. Post that, in the 1845s to 1849, the First and Second Anglo-Sikh Wars led to the defeat of the Sikhs and they came under the East India Company. As a result, when the War of Independence commenced, the British used a number of Sikh regiments to fight against the so called mutineers.
But then very soon, the Marathas, who in the previous century had some tragic setback with the Third Battle of Panipat, went on to start diminishing as a power by 1820.
The Marathas, who were a force to reckon with in the previous century, suffered this setback at the Third Battle of Panipat. Though they won the initial Anglo Maratha War, the subsequent Anglo Maratha Wars they lost. And by 1820, they were subject to a humiliating treaty, and the defeat of the Marathas was mourned throughout the nation within the empire as a loss of the national forces. So by 1820, the Marathas were no more a force to reckon with. By 1849, the Sikh Empire had almost come to an end, and with the Mughals have already having waned, the East India Company was left with no challengers. But then came the First War of Independence, which the British called the Sepoys Mutiny, and that was in 1857.
And that is why you will notice that in the First War of Independence in 1857, there is not much Sikh participation. On the contrary, the Sikhs fought on the side of the British because they were bound by a treaty during that war. And the 1857 war, however, shook the British Empire quite significantly. And from the East India Company, the transfer of power happened to pass on to the Queen of England.
I'll not go much into the details of the War of Independence of 1857, as most of you would be aware with the stories of Rani Lakshmibai, the Rani of Jhansi, Tatya Tope, and Bahadur Shah Zafar, etc. But the consequences are something important for us to take note. Firstly, the East India Company had to transfer the power to the Queen of England, but they were seriously shocked by the unity of the Indian forces, especially the Muslims and the Hindus fighting together against the British. And this made them to sit up and take stock of what were they not doing correctly. During that time, a British officer, one Captain William Lees, spent 4 years studying the Muslims of India. And he wrote a book, The Indian Mussalmans. He found that strangely, the Muslims in India considered themselves as the descendants of the foreign invaders from the preceding few centuries. They also thought of themselves as the rightful rulers to this nation. This was then used by the British to drive a wedge between the Hindus and the Muslims. and the Anglo Muslim alliance was formed in 1875. As a result of this, the first mosque came up in England and the foundation was laid for Aligarh Muslim University. This mindset laid the seeds for the partition of our country. It is important to understand how the British systematically dismantled our civilization. On the one hand, they exploited the fault lines between the Hindus and Muslims and drove a deep wedge between the two communities. Furthermore, they also found that the East India Company's policy of trying and cannibalizing kingdoms and usurping other smaller kingdoms on the pretext of an inheritance law or absence of any heirs to the king, they would go and then annex the territory. This proved counterproductive to them in the 1857 war, where a lot of smaller kingdoms are all lined up on the side of the so-called mutineers. So they then started a policy of fostering these princes. So instead of trying to annex the kingdom, they gave them a limited freedom wherein they were able to run their own administration as long as they uh, provide allegiance to the British Empire. So these rulers, there were about 600 plus of them. And remember, during the when India gained her independence, they gave independence to these 600 other principalities too. So what our leaders inherited was a country full of holes, which then Sardar Patel had to go and stitch together. So you see, on the one hand, they divided the communities. Then they also fostered this 600 plus small little kingdoms and principalities, thereby uh, punching holes in the fabric of the country. But that's not all. There's a lot more in this whole dismantling story. So, India had a very robust land management, land distribution system. But after the foreign invaders arrived, uh, they not coming from any great civilization and very poor experience in this whole land management and distribution system in the country actually fell into disarray, creating a whole middle layer of zamindars and jagirdars and elite nobles who were now controlling the land, and this became a huge burden on the peasant who was the actual tiller of the land. So when the East India Company arrived here, they found this kind of a system which was quite close to whatever the feudal system that they had back home. However, all that they did was they replaced this middle elite layer by themselves. As a result, the burden on the farmer became even more pronounced. Finally, in the 1857 war, neither the farmers nor the elite middle layer supported the British. So they learned a lesson and they decided henceforth they're going to foster this middle layer of elite noblemen and jagirdars and landowners. So they gave them a lot of concessions, perks, and they even gave them voting rights, which was a limited franchise. Actually, right up to independence, Mahatma Gandhi and the Congress Party quite bitterly fought with the British, asking for universal suffrage so that everybody could vote. But till independence, we did not have that. It was only after independence that every Indian citizen could vote. Prior to that, all voting on any issues were always happening with these elite people and this elite layer that was there and not the public at large. But this is not all, there's a lot more. The British were surprised at the level of education and literacy amongst the Indian population. Despite such a large population, they found that every Indian was very reasonably educated and literate. So they conducted surveys to find out how this was accomplished. And the reports of these surveys are still available in the British archives. They conducted these surveys, one in 1835 to 38 by a man called William Adam. He did the survey in the districts of Bengal and Bihar. And there he found that they had more than 100,000 schools operating. which means almost one per village and more than one if it was a larger village. And then they did similar surveys in the 1820s, um, in the Bombay presidency. And then there was also surveys done in the Madras presidency between 1822 to 25 and the Punjab presidency. In all these places, they found that there were schools and pathshalas that were running, and these were generally managed by the local temples. And how were they funded? The temples were funded by the revenues of the surrounding villages, and these revenues were utilized for imparting education. And these details are actually found in a beautiful book, A Beautiful Tree by Sri Dharampalji. He painstakingly copied all these survey reports and they brought out this book, which actually gives you details of the kind of subjects that were taught, the participants, etc. etc. You will be surprised that the participants were not just Brahmins and upper classes, but even all the other classes and castes. And they were all studying subjects like astronomy and medicine, etc. Yes, some of the Vedic studies was partially limited to the Brahmins children, but otherwise most of the other subjects were taught across the board to all the people. So the British, what did they do? Because they had nothing comparable in their own homeland where they struggled to educate their masses. So what they did was they completely dismantled this whole system by completely stopping the revenue to all these temple funds. And this revenue, once plugged, the temple slowly fell into disarray and the whole education system fell off. What they did after that was they brought in their own education system so that they could then impart their way of teaching. And this seriously eroded the whole fabric of society, which depended upon a very enlightened and far reaching education system.
But then the British systematically dismantled the systems and structures of this civilization.
So, 100,000 schools in just Bengal and Bihar districts, and similar numbers in the Madras presidency, Bombay presidency, and Punjab presidency. So, you can imagine the spread of education in the country. All of this slowly and certainly dismantled. So, you see, the British, what they did was divided the communities, fostered about 600 plus princes and kingdoms, encouraged a middle layer of zamindars and landowners, completely dismantled the education system. And with this, they were able to run this country barely using 1,000 officers of their own. And that is how they not only colonized and impoverished a nation, they completely destroyed or attempted to destroy a thriving civilization. So, in the preceding centuries, Bharat was badly damaged and bruised, but under the British rule, it was a complete dismantling of the civilization itself. But then the civilization did not give up that easily, as you will see in the coming episodes.
This is how we come to the end of the 19th century, friends. We shall see how the struggle continues and how we grasp to be able to retain to some of the tenets of our civilization whilst being pulled away from it and being torn apart in terms of the colonialization of our minds. More in the next episode, dear friends. Keep watching and thank you for your support.